Hello and welcome to Deo Volente NL. In one of our recent videos, we have proven that type 1 female circumcision is fully accepted in Islam and is considered sunnah, meaning it is a preferable act. In fact, all four major Sunni schools of thought agree on this matter. That video was then quickly followed up by a second episode in which we addressed the Orthodox Muslims specifically, who generally do not need to be convinced on the legitimacy of female circumcision and believe that it is something good to do. However, our videos are generally not made in English, but since the Islamic website whose claims we have examined is well known internationally, we decided to make an English version. Islam Q&A is an Orthodox Sunni website which shares thousands of fatwas online. In Fatwa 45528, they claim that scientists have proven that the correct sunnah way of doing a female circumcision brings many advantages and does not present any health risks. We have examined a couple of their sources for these claims and will prove to you that Islam Q&A has misled its following concerning the picture they have portrayed of these sources. In this video, we will prove that Islam Q&A has quoted at least two of their sources out of context. A context which actually makes it impossible for Orthodox Muslims to fit the source into their worldview. The first source, which is the World Health Organization, was quoted incorrectly and is in reality a source which vigorously opposes every form of female circumcision. And the second source, being Dr. Hamid al-Khawabi, is on the other hand so radical that he calls type 3 female circumcision the Sunnah version, while this is a strictly forbidden variant in Islam because of its severity, which does not correspond at all with Orthodox doctrine on this matter, as well as Islam Q&A's very own fatwas. We'll start with the most secular source the fatwa offers us, that of the World Health Organization. Islam Q&A quotes a book published by this organization as follows. In the book on traditions that affect the health of women and children, which was published by the World Health Organization in 1979, it says, with regard to the type of female circumcision, which involves removal of the prepuce of the clitoris, which is similar to male circumcision, no harmful health effects have been noted. End quote. The way this quote is presented to the reader implies that the book states there have been no health risks found in type 1 female circumcision. We managed to trace this book online in its entirety and immediately began searching for this quote. However, we could not find the exact citation anywhere. Because we wanted to give IslamQA.com the benefit of the doubt, we began looking for a quote resembling theirs or something of similar meaning. And that we did find. In all probability, the quote on Islam Q&A was constructed out of portions from these two paragraphs. Now, formally speaking, Islam Q&A is not telling a lie here, or as we should say, not yet. But we do point out the fact that it is a bit improper to fabricate an exact quote by joining two or more separate quotes together as one framed and reformulated statement. That being said, what we are really interested in is to research whether this source actually says that no health risks at all have been found by these scientists in the case of type 1 female circumcision. It appears to say just that. But when we further examined the book, we quickly noticed that there is a particular context in play, which Islam Q&A conveniently skipped over. Perhaps that's the reason they did not offer any page number for the reference to their already pieced together citation. This book from the World Health Organization consists of separate papers which in themselves are reports of a seminar concerning this and other practices. The topic of female circumcision is dealt with by three different authors from three different viewpoints. Islam Q&A's quote comes from the second article by one Dr. Robert Cook, as we can see at the top of his paper. But if we read carefully, we notice something important. The scope of Dr. Cook's research does not go beyond the physical health effects. He simply does not speak out on any possible psychological risks involved. It seems Islam Q&A left that contextual piece of information out when they tried to use a quote from this paper to prove female circumcision does not carry any adverse health risks. A bit of a delusive trick by Islam Q&A, which proves once again that we should always check the sources we are presented with. Blindly taking quotes from secondary sources brings the risk of error. On screen, you now see the summary which the reader of this book is presented with. it becomes clear that 3 papers will address this topic. The first, as you can see at the top, presents an historical overview together with a socio-cultural context. It also deals with the possible ways to fight female circumcision. The second paper is the one where the quote by Islam Q&A comes from. As shown earlier, we are reminded here that this paper merely handles the physical risks of female circumcision, and not the mental ones. And the third paper deals specifically with the psychological consequences of female circumcision in general. And that is where the bulk of our interest lies. Physical trauma is definitely a deep concern we have, and further along in this video we will certainly address this issue and refute this claim by Islam Q&A as well. However, the adverse psychological consequences can form a much bigger problem since physical wounds tend to heal, but the mind requires a lot more attention when traumatized by female circumcision of any type. Since the quote as presented by IslamQA.com was stripped of its context to hide the framed medical claim it states, we can speak of a twisting of the truth by the well-known Islamic fatwa-producing organization. They have surely done this to make it look like the World Health Organization is in full agreement with their own orthodox claims on female circumcision. However, you will see very shortly that this is not the case at all. In fact, the book they have presented as a friendly source speaks out against all forms of female circumcision in an unquestionable fashion. As was shown, the book presents 2 other papers besides that of Dr. Cook, which were made by respectively Dr. A.H. Taba and Dr. Taha Basher, who both, contrary to Dr. Cook, deal with the research in mental health risks of female circumcision as well as physical ones. In the first paper by Dr. Taba, which starts on page 43, we see several general statements on female circumcision as a whole. He does not discern between the different types, but makes a case against all forms of surgical interference in the genital area of young girls. For instance, when he states on page 47, "It is self-evident that any form of surgical interference in the highly sensitive genital organs constitutes a serious threat to the child, and the painful operation is a source of major physical and psychological trauma." End quote. Here Dr. Taba makes it very clear that according to him, any form of surgical interference in the highly sensitive genital organs creates health risks, both psychologically and physically, regardless of the type of female circumcision. An entirely different conclusion than the picture Islam Q&A tried to portray as the opinion of the World Health Organization. On a side note, we can easily assume that Dr. Taba refers only to female circumcision, since this entire book does not speak about its male equivalent. Given this statement by Dr. Taba, it is no surprise to read about his hopes of finding female circumcision one day completely eradicated from this world. On page 52, he says, "It is to be hoped that the day when female circumcision will be completely abolished is not too far distant." End quote. At this point, it becomes increasingly evident that this book more likely refutes the position of Islam Q&A rather than affirms it. Hence our curiosity on why the Islamic fatwa machine presented such poorly conducted research results which refute their own statements. Does Islam Q&A take their own fatwas seriously, we ask openly. One has to wonder if the truth matters at all to them. Or perhaps they are content with people's blind acceptance of their statements regardless of the level of their truth. We now take you further into the book of the World Health Organization, which Islam Q&A tried to pass as a female circumcision-friendly source. We go to the third paper, which starts on page 71 and is made by Dr. Taha Basher. This paper lays its focus upon the psychological side of the story, while the paper from which IslamQA.com quoted merely concentrated on the physical effects. Dr. Basher starts off with an historical account of the tradition of female circumcision. I will quote from page 73, where it says, "In the absence of any clear indication in the Holy Quran and in the Prophet Muhammad's tradition, hadith, leading Arab theologians such as Shaykh Shaltut refuted the argument based on religious doctrine for the practice of female circumcision. Nonetheless, from the historical viewpoint, female circumcision has been practiced due to misleading interpretations and under the pretext of adherence to religious principles." End quote. Here we read that Dr. Taha Bashir of the World Health Organization is of the opinion that female circumcision has nothing to do with Islam whatsoever, and that people who claim it does are misleading those they speak to. This obviously is inconsistent with the orthodox teaching of Islam Q&A, which support female circumcision from a theological viewpoint in particular. Indeed, it is evenly incompatible with our own findings on Islamic jurisprudence as seen in our previous video on this matter. But what this says is that Orthodox Muslims who want to refer to this book as a positive case for female circumcision will redundantly shoot themselves in the foot. It is now blatantly clear that the scientists of the World Health Organization are anything but in sync with Orthodox teachings on female circumcision. Now that we have shown that Islam Q&A's own source speaks against them, let's dig into some of the other statements in their fatwa. Here we see that one Dr. Hamid al-Khawabi is of the opinion that female circumcision reduces excessive sexual desire. However, it is unclear in which context these claims were made. Did he mention these benefits regarding just the type 1 circumcision, which is the only allowed form in Islam? Or could he have been saying this in the context of the forbidden forms as well? We will later on show you that Dr. al-Khawabi is in fact a strong advocate of the type 3 female circumcision, and can therefore not be a source that is consistent with Islam Q&A's worldview. But let us first turn once more to the book of the World Health Organization to see if the opinion that the female circumcision reduces sexual desire is shared by them. I quote to you from page 87. After all, circumcision is not the best method of controlling female sexual desire. Indeed, education, guidance, and faith are the correct way of doing so. End quote. Although the scientist here quotes the statement of a respondent during an interview, it is clear that he wishes to emphasize this thought when we see his quote of a similar statement from the work of Dr. Ahmed Saad el-Din el-Hakim, the former head of Mental Health Department, Ministry of Health in Cairo. I quote to you from page 110. It is thought that circumcision causes delayed sexual arousal in the female, but there are no direct data on this matter. Only indirect information from opium addicts who claim that they resorted to the drug after frustrations from delayed sexual arousal in their circumcised wives. End quote. From this we can conclude that this book claims there is no proof alluring to the idea that female circumcision actually reduces sexual desire in women, and that it is not the best method to achieve this goal were this opportune to begin with. In fact, the only indirect evidence that might suggest this reveals a negative effect of female circumcision, seeing that men in the given example complain that their circumcised wives cannot be satisfied. Something not very favorable for any marriage, it seems. In closing of our use of the book by the World Health Organization, we quote again page 110, where Dr. Ahmed Saad el-Din el-Hakim continues saying, "The fact is that female circumcision is actually an evolutional regression. It results in degradation and humiliation for future women. A psychiatric trauma will last due to the painful operational experience. It may lead to later rejection of a husband and need for psychiatric intervention." End quote. He speaks clearly and makes no discernment whatsoever between the different types of female circumcision. This while we cannot deny his knowledge of the existing types. If the mentioned conclusions would not have applied to type 1 female circumcision, according to this scientist, surely he would have made his distinction known to us. We continue the review of Dr. Hamid al-Khawabi. As shown, he is repeatedly quoted by IslamQA.com. For instance, when claiming that female circumcision reduces sexual desire in females, which is apparently something positive according to Orthodox Muslims. But let us examine some of the other findings of Dr. al-Khawabi to see if this source is trustworthy and consistent with Islam Q&A's own views. The book you see now tells us that Dr. Hamid al-Khawabi is of the opinion that a much more severe variant of female circumcision is the Sunnah type. So how can Islam Q&A quote from this man? Because of this, it can be no surprise that the fatwa does not tell us that Dr. al-Khawabi made his claims within the context of a form of female circumcision which involves the removal of the clitoris and the labia minora, which corresponds with type 3 circumcision and not type 1. We can even show you that Islam Q&A themselves hold to type 1 circumcision as the Sunnah version, as is mentioned in their fatwa with number 9412, as shown on screen. We read that Shaykh Ibn Taymiyyah declares that the correct form of female circumcision involves the removal of a tiny piece of skin, again, something corresponding with type 1 circumcision alone. Islam Q&A also boasted in Al-Khawabi's bizarre claim that female circumcision can cure an unpleasant odor in the female organ. And again, of course, here, Islam Q&A does not mention the fact that their Dr. Khawabi proposes the removal of the clitoris and the labia minora as the best cure for this, something viewed by Orthodox Muslims as barbaric and un-Islamic, we are told. But it gets worse. On page 57 of the mentioned work in where Dr. Al-Khawabi is quoted, he even seems to claim that nymphomania is a disease which the male can catch from interactions with the female and from which he could even die. This absurd claim is further proof of the so-called expertise of this doctor, who is, by the way, not a scientist, but a mere gynecologist. Now that we've seen that Dr. Al-Khawabi is a very radical doctor who goes beyond the borders Islam has set for him, and that he holds quite superstitious, unscientific theories, it seems wise to also quote to you from this book, which reveals more on the reputation of Dr. Al-Khawabi in the medical field. In this book, it is told that Dr. Al-Khawabi comes from a long line of Muslim doctors who have been presenting the same fallacies on this topic for decades, which are not shared at all by the rest of the medical world. Page 319 of this book tells us the following. Other doctors who were proponents of female genital mutilation responded to the initiative of Al-Doctor by writing articles in periodicals with an Islamist orientation. Dr. Hamid Al-Khawabi, a gynecologist and a zealous advocate of female genital mutilation, wrote a series of articles in the Islamist review Lawa al-Islam, Banner of Islam. Their 1951 predecessors mentioned all the fallacies which are still promoted by the doctors who are proponents of female genital mutilation today. End quote. It says here that attempts were made in the 1950s to scientifically prove to the people that female circumcision is unnecessary in the hope that this would make the practice disappear. However, these claims were then challenged by other Islamic doctors whose unfounded fallacies were later repeated by other Islamist doctors like Hamid Al-Khawabi. This shows us that Islam Q&A is not only quoting a very biased Islamist doctor, but also one who is known for his radical and unscientific stance. In light of all this, it must be said that quotes by this doctor cannot be used as a positive case for type 1 circumcision. On the contrary. Conclusions. It's safe to say that Islam Q&A has misled its readers and is severely inconsistent with its quotes and references. We've shown you that this website has cited an alleged doctor who openly supports the in Islam forbidden types of female circumcision. Therefore, it is clear that the quotes referred to by Islam Q&A must be seen in the context of type 3 circumcision and not the only legal type in Islam, which is type 1. Also, you've seen that this was not the only incident where Islam Q&A quoted books out of context. After all, we concluded earlier that Islam Q&A made a quote from the World Health Organization appear to rule positively towards type 1 female circumcision, while it is evident that this was not the case at all, by showing you that the quote was taken from a paper which is restricted to the physical consequences of the procedure only. This while the rest of the book has shown to be filled with warnings regarding negative mental consequences of any type of female circumcision. As we explained beforehand, this video was made particularly for Orthodox and other Muslims who claim that female circumcision is something preferable to do to little girls, as is taught to them by true Sunni Islam. And because one of their most trusted sources has now been exposed as misleading, we hope that these individuals will begin to do their own research from now on, rather than relying blindly on websites such as Islam Q&A. For we have shown that their methods of research are all but reliable. Thank you for watching, and God bless.